Without further ado, I am going to introduce Rabbi Becher. So just to give you maybe a little bit fuller of a bio, Rabbi Becher, who you will hear, is from originally Australia. He is currently an instructor at Yeshiva University and is an alumni rabbi of Neve Yerushalayim College. He received smicha both from the rabbinut and from the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. He learned in Yeshivas Itri and was a Talmud of Rav Moshe Shapiro. On top of that, he has an MA from Bernard Revel in medieval studies, and I believe is currently working on a doctorate, though I don't know if I'm speaking too soon. Amongst other things, has taught at Or Sameach, Neve Yerushalayim, was a member, served in the IDF. On top of that, he has answered thousands of questions at AskTheRabbi.org, and it presents a Talmud class on the dimensions of the Daf for the Jewish Broadcasting Service. He was a senior lecturer for Gateways for about 20 years, and I believe his book, Gateway to Judaism, is in its 10th edition, published from ArtScroll. He has taught around the world on his own and as a scholar in residence, for the Legacy Kosher Tours, and that's taken him from exotic places. I'm not even going to list them all. I don't know, Morocco, Japan, India, Italy, Hungary. I'm sure there's a lot more. Egypt, a lot more places I could say. And I'll say like this: it actually happens to be my personal, and I emphasize the personal pleasure to introduce Rabbi Becher, because I had the pleasure of teaching alongside him for about 7 years at Yeshiva University. During that time, we covered, well, it wasn't that, it was one of the years I think we had a Chavrusin Bava Batra, and we got maybe through half of it. I don't know if we got through the whole thing, but I can tell you guys, you are in for a pleasure to hear from Rabbi Mordechai Becher. Rabbi Becher, I'm sure I missed something of your extensive bio, so if you'd like to add, please, I'll stop speaking and let Rabbi Becher, you have the stage. This is Finding Your Soulmate, Free Will versus Fate.
Matt, thank you for the amazing introduction. I can hardly wait to hear myself speak now. But it does, unfortunately, with introductions like that, it does type of raise expectations to extraordinary levels. So I hope you'll understand that Matt was lying about most of it. But nevertheless, one thing is true, we were chavrusas. But okay. We're not doing this on Tu B'Av because I'm going to Turkey tomorrow, or Turkey, more correctly, and leading a tour there. Hence, we're doing this preemptive strike on Tu B'Av. So I was reading Mishpacha magazine yesterday. I do that in order to elevate my blood pressure. There was, of course, the famous, they have a section of the Shidduch hotline and stuff like that. And it's, it does, the word besheret crops up a lot in that magazine. And besheret is a Yiddish word which means destined. And it basically means, and I think that's how people understand it, that there is a destined match, soulmate, for every single person from time immemorial, not necessarily time immemorial really, but from very early times. And that it is, and it seems to be that the way it's understood by many people is that it's almost like a predestination that you will meet your besheret. There is this person who is destined for you. And what we'll see is that's not quite the way it's understood by most of our sages. It's also interesting to note that there is also debate about how much of a role does your free will play in this? In other words, is there a possibility that because I made a stupid decision, I missed my besheret forever? That's a horrific thought. Is there only one person, one soulmate possible for every person, or is it possible to have multiple soulmates? You know, these are questions which we're going to try to clarify. Although, as you will all see, this is a nuanced and very complex subject in which there's a lot of contradictory ideas, and not at all what is popular. So let's begin with one of the primary sources for the idea that there is an actual soulmate that exists even before you are born. And that is actually in the book of the Zohar. Do not mess with the Zohar. It's the Zohar in Parshas Tazria. And the Zohar says the following. It says, Tochaze, come and see. Just by the way, those who are familiar with the Talmud will know that the Talmud, when it wants to bring a proof or introduce something to you, it will say to shma, which means come and hear. The Zohar usually always says to chaze, come and see. And there are those who would explain that Moshe Shapiro explained one of the reasons for that is that hearing something is more of a format of a logical reasoning based on rational arguments, step upon step upon step. So come and hear, and I will show you, prove it to you, and you can listen. Whereas the Zohar is much more about ideas which are presented to you as a vision, as a fait accompli, etc., without necessarily the steps of proof and rational logic ahead of time. So it's tochaze, come and see. Interesting, just as an aside, parenthetically, often when questions are asked in the Zohar of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and others, the respondent will start crying before he answers the question. Interesting, Rabbi Moshe Shapiro used to say that one of the reasons for that is that tears obscure the physical vision, but they will sometimes help enhance one's spiritual perception. So hence they cry, bechia, which actually comes from the word mevuche, confusion, blurriness, etc. And then you can now, the tochaze, what you can see in terms of the spiritual perception is much greater. That's all, close parentheses, you can continue listening now. So in any case, this is what the Zohar says. Kol ruchin da'alma, every spirit, every soul in the world, klulin dechar v'nukva, includes in it male and female. V'kadnafkin, when they come into the world, these souls, dechar v'nukva nafkin, they come into the world as male and female. Ulabasar misparshim ba'orchayu, and they go their separate ways. Izachi barnash, if the person merits, lebasar mizdavgei kechada, that person will come back to their other half, the male or female half, v'haino bas zugo, and that is their soulmate, bat zug. Umischabram b'zivuga, and they join together, chad b'chola, unite as one unit in everything, rucha v'gufa, both spiritually and physically. A very beautiful picture which the Zohar paints, that in primordial, before entry into this world, the soul, spirits, have a male and a female component. When they come into this world, those components separate into a male, into a female. And there's a process of separation, but then there's a process of reunification. And according to the Zohar, if one merits this, then one finds their other, and this is where the expression, the other half, I don't know if this is where the expression comes from, but this would seem to be support for that expression, this idea of the other half. That is how the Zohar puts it. It's in Parshas Tazria. And this is supported by another famous statement in the Talmud. Talmud in Maseches Soita, the very beginning of Soita, by the way, deals with the type of ironic that the primary source for the idea of finding a shidduch and finding your mate and so on and so forth is the beginning of the tractate that deals with adultery. Like, you know, that's what Soita deals with, the laws of suspected adultery, etc. But that's where the source texts are for a lot of this idea. In any case, the very first page of Maseches Soita, and it says the following. Very, very interesting. It says, Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. He said this. He says, Kashe zivugan kekriyas yamsuf. That there's a difficulty in finding, in zivugan, there's a difficulty in, it sounds like, there's a difficulty in creating a match, lezavgan, a zivug, zug, which actually is a Greek word, as in, but zug means a pair. So it's difficult to unite them, like the crossing of the Red Sea. No, there's a miraculous nature to having a finding your mate. And then it says, and it brings a verse to support that. And then the Gemara asks, how could that be? That's not true. Aini, that doesn't seem to be correct, because we have another tradition. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav the following, and this is probably cited at every single vort and engagement party ad nauseum, which says this: Arba'im yom lifnei yitziras avad, 40 days before the formation of the fetus, Baskol, a heavenly voice, comes out and proclaims that A, so-and-so will marry B. So the Gemara says, how could you say that this finding of a mate is as difficult as the crossing of the Red Sea, when we have another tradition that says it was predestined, sounds like it was predestined even before you were born, that you have someone who you will have, this will be your soulmate. Complete contradiction. So the Gemara answers in a very, very interesting answer, which there's a lot of debate about what that answer means and what this whole statement means. And the Gemara says, Ha bezivug rishon, that which it says that there's a predestiny about it, that it was decreed 40 days beforehand, that is the first zivug, your first match. And that which it says that is difficult as the crossing of the Red Sea, that refers to the second match, second zivug. Now, what does it mean, first match and second match? A simple reading, if you would look at the Sonsino, or actually no one knows what Sonsino is. If you look at Sefaria, right, whatever, right, it will probably say something like first marriage, second marriage. That the first marriage is destiny. It was already decreed 40 days before birth. And the second marriage, that's rough. That's much more difficult. But it's interesting that that's not how a number of the Rishon, number of the commentaries don't explain it that way. Let me first of all tell you that Rashi, the most famous commentary on pretty much everything, and one of my kids came back from school a long time ago. I said, "What'd you do today?" He said, "Nothing," which usually was a response that made me quite happy. It means there was no vandalism, no fights, like fantastic. I said, "Well, what did you learn today?" He said, "Nothing." Also pretty standard response. I said, "Tell me one thing." He said, "We learned that Rashi lived during recess." I said, "What the heck are you talking about?" I said, "What did the teacher say?" He said, "The Rebbe said Rashi lived from 1040 to 1105. So anyway, yeah, shockingly, he's now a lawyer, that kid, not Rashi, the kid. Anyway, so, but Rashi writes in his commentary the following. Rashi says that the first match is according to Mazal, is based on Mazal. Mazal can be loosely translated as initial conditions that have nothing to do with your merit, punishment, etc. The initial conditions. Rav Dessler says the word mazal comes from the Hebrew word yizal. If you go to a doctor in Israel, the doctor might say, Yeshecha nazelet, you've got a running nose, right, nazelet, right? So nozlim are liquids in Hebrew. So yizal, mazal means that which flows from a higher source, i.e. your initial conditions. So it sounds like from Rashi that the match which was decided 40 days before you were born is type of the match which is based on initial conditions, i.e. if I would enter all your situation, place of birth, family, ethnicity, and so on and so forth into some type of algorithm, and someone else, which is actually probably what GamZuli does. Anyway, but and enter someone else's into the algorithm, it would come up with that person. That's the person you should, that's the person, that's Zivug Rishon, and that is Mazal. Type of interesting. What is Zivug Sheni? Rashi says, LeVee is based on your merit. In other words, let's say I'm from Melbourne, Australia. It could be, according to Mazal, my initial match was a woman who also was from Melbourne, Australia, very possible, right? Maybe had similar interests to me. I hope not, because I don't really want a violent spouse. But anyway, so maybe had different similar interests and so on and so forth, right? And that's who however, right, that's assuming I don't have greater merit or assuming I don't have punishment, right? Thank God I merited a woman from Philadelphia, my wife, and we met in Australia, but Sydney, not Melbourne. But nevertheless, that may be certainly based on my merit. I don't know about my wife. Could be she got punished, but there's an idea that of our merit. That's the Zivug, and the Meiri says something very similar to Rashi, but even more extreme. The Meiri says, who lived in Provence just a little after Rashi, the Meiri, Menachem HaMeiri, says this: Zivug Rishon is when you get married before you are worthy of punishment or reward. Meaning you got married before age 12 if you're a woman, girl, and before age 13 if you're a boy. But Zivug, and that, he says, that's based totally on prior circumstances that have nothing to do with your merit or otherwise. However, if you get married after the age of 12 or 13, which in the modern world is universal, unless you're in a cult, right? I mean, there's 100% right. That means it is based on merit and it's based on either reward or punishment, which means, according to the Meiri, that whole first statement, which says that 40 days before this person is predestined for you, 40 days before a voice from heaven proclaims you're going to marry so-and-so, that's only if you would have gotten married before you were age 12 or 13, in which case you don't have merits or demerits because you're not yet obligated in the commandments. But if you get married after the age 12 or 13, which I'm looking at some of the pictures here, that seems to be obvious, right? Then it's got nothing to do with any type of predestiny. It's completely based on divine providence, based on merit or otherwise. In other words, it falls under the standard category of virtually everything else in life. Just like everything in life, right? There's a combination of factors, and one of the major factors is my merit, reward for what I've done good, punishment for what I've done bad, not me, obviously, but the rest of you, right? Punishment for what we've done bad, and so on and so forth, right? That is what things are based on. That's according to the Meiri. And Rashi seems to imply that that's also true. And so it seems already from the Talmud that we're not completely agreeing with the Zohar. Because according to the Talmud, this idea of the 40 days before creation, a voice from heaven says you're marrying so-and-so, is not, according to the Meiri, it's just not relevant to anyone because we all get married after we're adults, in which case merit comes into play, punishment comes into play, and so on and so forth. According to Rashi, it appears also to be that Zivug Rishon is according to Mazal, meaning initial conditions that would be, let's say, calculated by an emotionless computer, chat GPT or whatever it is, right? And the Zivug Sheni, in which we are told that's rough, that's difficult, that's like miraculous in a sense, that is apparently for all of us the case. That's at least according to what it sounds like from the Talmud. There's another piece of Talmud which I have to throw in, which is cited by Tosfos, and they say the following. The Gemara says in Moed Katan, as you might know, there are certain times of the year that we don't do marriages, right? We just got over the 3 weeks. I'm still recovering. Right, but we have 3 weeks. You don't do marriages during the 3 weeks. When else don't you do a marriage? Usually during Chol HaMoed, during the intermediate days of Pesach and Sukkot, we don't do weddings. So there are times of the year where either by law, halacha, or custom, we don't do marriages. The Gemara, however, says in Moed Katan means minor festival. So a lot of Moed Katan does deal with Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of Pesach and of Sukkot, right? A minor festival to some degree. So there it says this, Shmuel says the following, Mutar la'ares isha b'chol HaMoed. You can, although you cannot get married Chol HaMoed, you can get engaged Chol HaMoed. You can have an engagement party, right, etc., etc. And why is that so? So the Gemara says, Shema yikadmenu acher. If you find someone that you want to get engaged to, hurry up, do it right away. Shema yikadmenu acher, which is what it means in the Gemara, lest someone else engage her first. And I don't know, maybe she's dating 2 guys at once. Maybe you're dating the guys. I don't know the situation, but someone else may grab this person. And the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Right? Doesn't Shmuel is the one who said back in the Gemara in Soita, right, which was right after the Zohar, he says 40 days before, a voice from heaven comes out and says, you'll get so-and-so will get married to so-and-so. So what are you worried about? Why are you worried that someone else may precede you? Is it not based on that voice from heaven predestined? So the Gemara says, well, it's true, but Shemi Yikadmenu Barachamim, maybe the other person will daven so sincerely and so deeply and with such fervor, right, that he may merit to get engaged to this person that you were about to get engaged to. So you got to rush. And according to some, right, it's pretty dramatic. It even says maybe that person maybe he'll die as a result of this guy's prayers. That's quite extreme, but who knows, right? And it appears to be saying that there is the possibility of changing this whole decree through prayers. Even if, now, you're probably all wondering, and I can see on mostly black screens, but on some of the screens I can see people are looking with wonder and saying, well, what do you mean? First of all, what about this whole thing about first match and second match? Right? Shmuel says you can get engaged on Pesach, Shavuos, etc. Why? Lest someone else get this person first. The Gemara asks, well, didn't Shmuel say that 40 days before a voice from heaven comes out and says, you're marrying so-and-so? But Tosfot says, well, why don't we just answer the same as we said over there? One is talking about the first match, one is about the second match. Right? Is that question not type of fairly obvious? Right? So Tosfot says, because even in the case of the first match, prayer may trump everything. In other words, according to Rashi and Tosfot, both in Moed Katan, it appears that in the realm of finding your match, there is the normal principles of reward and punishment might be trumped by God's decree. The only thing that might change that is extreme prayer. If you pray for a different marriage, right, or someone else prays, in other words, prayer could even change that destiny. And this is a general rule we actually say, there's the Talmud says, Ein mazal li Yisrael, right? That doesn't mean Jews are unlucky. What it means is that mazal, chance, statistics don't affect the Jews. But what commentaries explain, what that means is that we are affected by statistics. It's just that great merit or prayer can override and overcome that. Right? And as we know, if we were affected by statistics, state of Israel, where some of you live and where I just visited, would not exist. Right? If we were affected by statistics and probability, none of us would be here identifying as Jews talking about Torah. We'd be gone a long time ago. So obviously merit, prayer, ancestral merit, zchus avos, and so on and so forth can have an impact in these areas. So it appears at least that the same would be true with marriage. So according to this, according to everything we've said now, yeah, there is an ideal match for you based on what we call initial circumstances, mazal, and so on and so forth. All right. If you have sufficient merit, you might do better than that. If, God forbid, person's punished, they may do worse than that. Right? And even with that destined match based on initial conditions, it can be changed by prayer, can be changed by merit. And that's all leaving aside the Meiri's argument, which is that that whole destiny thing only applies if you get married before you have any merit, which is you're not bar bar mitzvah yet, but bar or bat mitzvah yet, right? If you're married after bar or bat mitzvah, like all of us, then this whole thing doesn't apply. It's purely merit and prayer and so on and so forth. That's not to say, even if you follow the Meiri, it still may be that there's someone who is suited to you based on initial circumstances. That's, I think, obvious, right? Why would we disagree with that? In other words, the idea that personality-wise, background-wise, taste-wise, so on and so forth, there's another person who is ideally suited to you. That's not a controversial idea. Of course there is, right? So why not? But whether that's inevitably predestined, that it doesn't seem to be the case, even though some say yes, there is a predestiny, but that can still be affected by other factors like prayer, merit, and so on and so forth. Along these lines, we have the Rambam. The Rambam, Maimonides, your Monides, our Monides, Maimonides, the Rambam says has two sources regarding this idea of besheret. Obviously, besheret's a Yiddish word, and shockingly, the Rambam did not speak Yiddish, but he's got two sources about this. One, he was asked 3 questions by a convert by the name of Ovadia, who is an Arab who converted to Judaism. They're, by the way, not to be confused with Ovadia Johann from Italy, who also converted to Judaism and moved to Cairo, but this is a different person. There were 2 Gerim who crop up at that time, both called Ovadia. Ovadia himself, the great prophet Ovadia, was himself a convert. So hence, Ovadia is a name that converts to. Okay. In any case, Ovadia asked Maimonides 3 questions, and Maimonides responds to them so beautifully. One of the questions he asks is the following. He says, what does it mean that, this idea that everything's in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven? He says, Ovadia was confused by this. Does this mean that all actions, everything is in God's hands and predestined and divine decree? What happened to my free will? And he asks also about this idea that the Talmud, Ovadia, obviously, as a convert, maybe he'd studied a little bit. He must have studied something. And he said also the Gemara seems to indicate that even my choice of spouse was preordained 40 days before birth. He quotes the Gemara in Soita. So what do you think? So this is a great thing because the Rambam's addressing our question. Ovadia asked the Rambam our question, and the Rambam responds in a very eloquent, beautiful way. And by the way, most of the Rambam's letters were written in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew. When he wrote to this person who's a convert, he wrote them in Hebrew. which is interesting because this Ovadia was a native Arab speaker who was a convert from Islam. But I think the Rambam was type of showing him that he is one of us. And I'm addressing you not even in the Arabic that I would use for other Jews who live in Arab-speaking countries. I'm addressing you in Hebrew because you are like that. Like, that's my conjecture. In any case, so therefore what I'm reading from is actually the Rambam's response in his own language. And he says this. He says, when it says everything's in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven, under that category of the fear of heaven is included everything which is of a moral or ethical nature. Any area in which a decision is made that is pertaining to something which is prohibited, permitted, obligatory, etc., that is not in the hands of heaven. God, he says, has granted us complete free will. God has granted us freedom to choose. We don't have the freedom to decide what is good and bad. That's free will authority that we do not have. But free will ability, the choice between good and evil, that we do have. And that is a very famous and foundational idea in the Torah. Without the idea of free will, there is no good and evil. Without the idea of free will, there's no righteous or evil people. Without the idea of free will, life is more or less meaningless. And so free will is very central. And he says, now you'll ask me, what about that Gemara? He says, let me tell you, that Gemara that says 40 days before, he says that all that it means is that there are exceptional circumstances in which a person, because who has exceptional merit, God will make sure that he'll meet or she will meet their ideal spouse. Person who has exceptional sins, Hashem will make sure that they meet someone terrible, right? And so on and so forth. But he says, since, and he goes on to quote, he quotes his own commentary on Pirkei Avos, Ethics of the Fathers, his introduction called 8 Chapters, which happens to have 8 chapters. And he says there that, look, to marry someone with chuppah and kiddushin is a mitzvah. To engage in procreation is a mitzvah. He says, how could it be preordained? How could it be predestined? It's a matter of free will, right? Either you are fulfilling an obligation or you're not fulfilling an obligation. There are people you are not allowed to marry. There are many people that is prohibited for a regular Jew to marry. And there are people that a Kohen cannot marry. And there are occasions, very few and far between, where it's a mitzvah to marry someone, yibum, for example, levirate marriage. But he says, because the nature of marriage is mitzvah, obligatory, sin, permitted, etc., he says, how could it be decreed by heaven? He says, not possible, because that would be a contradiction to the free will. And he says, in the Torah itself, we see this, because the Torah says one of the exemptions from military service in biblical times was a man who had betrothed a woman but had not yet completed the marriage by doing chuppah, etc. In other words, and why are we concerned? He's exempt, he says, because lest he die in war and someone else marries this person. Now, Maimonides says if he was predestined to marry this person, he won't die because he hasn't yet finished the marriage. So he's safe. He doesn't have to wear his flat jacket, doesn't have to wear the heavy plate, schwitzing in sun. He doesn't forget it. No worries. Don't take cover. Don't wear your helmet. No, right? I'm okay because I got engaged, so it's inevitable. No, he says that's ridiculous. He says, now you'll tell me, but what about the Gemara? He says, when you've got explicit verses in the Torah and a Gemara that sounds a little different, you have to re-understand the Gemara. He says, when you've got a central principle supported by verses in the Torah and by logic, and it's central to Emunah, and there is a statement in the Talmud that doesn't seem to fit with that, then what do you have to reinterpret? Not the verse in the Torah, but the statement in the Talmud. Maimonides says, and that statement in the Talmud is not merely saying, but what it's saying here is, so he puts it, Im zeh ha'ish, or zot ha'isha, if this man or this woman, asu mitzvah, they did a great deed of merit, that as a result of doing that mitzvah, God has decreed that they should be worthy of a wonderful, tremendous match. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mezavgan ze lezeh, God will make sure they meet. If they have sins, that means that they will have a marriage which is a terrible marriage. Hashem will make sure they meet that person. In neither case will God force the hand of each of them to say, yes, that they have to get married. No, their free will is still involved. It's just that God will engineer, social engineering will engineer things that they'll meet. And when they meet, and this person is a fantastic, ideal match, yeah, they'll get married, right? And that he says is, and he quotes a Gemara that says that the person who, Mamzer and Mamzer's tragic case of a person who was born of, not to be confused with the English term bastard, which means someone born out of wedlock. In halacha, a mamzer is someone born of incestuous or an adulterous relationship. Someone who is born out of wedlock is a 100% kosher Jew. No problem. I mean, they may have problems, but halachically speaking, no problem, right? Mamzer is specifically someone born from incest or adultery. They can only marry another mamzer. And Maimonides says that if that mamzer has sufficient merit, and that mamzeres has sufficient merit, God will ensure that one from one side of the world will meet this person from the other side of the world, and they'll get married. In other words, the circumstances. And so Maimonides would seem to disagree, not seem, he definitely disagrees with the idea of a predestiny when it comes to marriage. He definitely disagrees with the idea that free will is not involved. And he proves that it's not possible to say that free will is not involved. It has to be. Because marriage is what we call hakol b'yedei Shamayim. Everything's in the hands of heaven except fear of heaven. What does fear of heaven include? Everything that is either obligatory, prohibited, permitted, moral, ethical, halachic, those areas are where we say that free will takes a role. Now, I see we're rapidly running out of time. So is that right? Yes. So what I'm going to do is where does this leave us? Where does it leave us? So am I supposed to say now that you have to do GamZuli? No, okay, no, I'm sorry. Where do I put that in? Doesn't matter, right? But where does that leave us? So it leaves us, and this is of course the view. There's a number of great rabbis talk about this. The Be'er Sheva talks about this, and Rav Tzemach Duran, just one Duran. But they talk about this idea. And one of the things they point out is that, look, this is Be'er Sheva says, there's a destined soulmate for you, meaning there is a person out there who's probably, from all, statistically, et cetera, an ideal match for you. Maybe even, as the Zohar says, right, the other half of that soul. But he says you have to earn the privilege of finding that person, meaning you have to have sufficient merit, you have to engage in tshuva, repentance, Torah, Masin Tovin, and so on and so forth, and prayer to hope that you will meet that person. That's according to the Be'er Sheva. Maimonides and the Meiri would say that that it's just like everything else, meaning you do your efforts, and also, in other words, your physical effort, your pragmatic efforts, and you also pray, and you also hope that you have sufficient merit. Right? I want to end with what the Chovos Halvavos says. Rabachia, in the Chovos Halvavos, although yes, I'm quoting. He wrote that in Arabic as well, so I'm quoting from the Hebrew translation, actually the English translation of the Hebrew translation. But in Chovos Halvavos, in the third section, which is called Avodas Elokim, in chapter 8, someone asked him about the apparent contradiction between God's decrees and human free will. And Rabbeinu Becher says something very pragmatic and interesting. He says, we don't really, and we cannot understand the contradiction and the resolution of divine providence and human free will. It's beyond us. I should point out, parenthetically, Rav Nachman of Breslov pointed out, so actually, God willing, tomorrow I'm going to Istanbul, where he spent quite a while on his way to Israel and on his way back. But Rav Nachman of Breslov said, he says, God whom I can understand is not a God who I would worship. But anyway, but Chovos HaLevavos says something similar. He says this. He says, some find it possible to accept both the principle of necessity, divine decree, and righteousness, meaning human free will. And they say this. This is how Chovos HaLevavos puts it. He says, you have to divide up. You have to have a bit of a split mind, meaning you have to act as though everything depends upon merit and upon your activities, but you have to think and know that ultimately it's up to God. Type of interesting. In other words, in action, let's put it into the sphere of making a living. So I have to apply for a job. I have to get qualifications for a decent job so I can support family. I have to get insurance. I have to get right. Moshe Feinstein says it's a mitzvah to buy insurance because in the absence of income, it would be miraculous for money to drop out of the sky to support the family. So he says, so insurance is a mitzvah, obligation. Any insurance salesman out there, right? You can feel free to quote Igros Moshe to your potential clients. All right. In the same way, it's a mitzvah to engage in earning a living. In the same way, it's a mitzvah to make efforts to find a spouse. Right. And the Chovos HaLevavos says you have to engage in that as though it depends on your efforts. He says, but at the same time, you have to have in mind that even with all of my best efforts, it's up to God in terms of divine providence, right? And I have to have merit as well. So it's not just effort, it's also merit. And it's not just merit, it's also effort. So he says you have to act as though it's all effort, and you have to think as though it's all merit. Does that make sense to anyone? Right? In other words, you have to, so to speak, we have to, right, walk a balancing rope. That on the one hand, to understand that we have to put in logical efforts into finding a spouse. We cannot just sit back and hope that he or she will drop out of the sky, right, materialize next to me. So we have to put in logical efforts, etc. We also have to understand that there's a special merit that you need to meet the person who is suitable for you. And that requires effort in a different area. That requires effort spiritually, that effort of self-improvement, the effort of repentance, the effort of prayer, the effort of mitzvahs and chesed and kindness, and so on and so forth. So like in all areas, we have a duality that we approach, as it's true in making a living, medical areas. You know, the Shulchan Aruch, coded Jewish law, says before you take medication, you're supposed to say a little prayer. Yehi Ratzon, or not much just medication, medical procedures. You say, may it be your will, my God and the God of my ancestors, that this activity should heal me. So the Code of Jewish Law says, take the medicine, do the medical procedure, say the prayer too. Like they say a priest during the First World War used to say, praise God and pass the ammunition. And that's really where we are now. So it's hard to summarize everything, but more or less, is there an ideal person for? Oh, you know, I should have mentioned also the Arizal, which is a totally different understanding of the first match and second match. The Arizal of Isaac Luria says the first match is if you're in this world for the first time, meaning you're not a reincarnation. And that if you're in this world for the first time, then your match is preordained and it will come easily. He says, if, however, you are a reincarnation, which is true of most of us, right? As you can, just looking at me, you can see I was once a Viking warrior, right? And so, but if we are here for a second or a third time, meaning we are a reincarnation, then it requires greater merit and it's not preordained, right? Either way, I think everyone agrees that there is someone ideal for you. Makes sense. It's logical. No one has disagreed with that in all the sources I've seen. Everyone agrees you have to make efforts in both the physical and the spiritual spheres, efforts on a pragmatic level and efforts in improving myself. It's just that some say that when you make sufficient efforts, God will, with your, as reward, will organize things that you will meet this ideal person. No. And others say, no, that's not the idea. God, there's that if you have sufficient merit, there's an inevitability about meeting that person. But everyone agrees that even if you meet that person, it's still your decision, right? I don't think anyone of the sources that I saw would deny that free will takes a role in the final choice, right? That's one of the reasons some say we don't say shechianu, right, on getting engaged, right? Why? Because shechianu is said on things that there's a divine input. The Chassan Sofer says this, a divine input that has done it, like financial stuff that comes to me, like a new fruit, nigmar b'dei shamayim, but something which depends on another person's free will and my free will. We don't say shechianu, but it's not totally, it's a combination of factors. That's a little bit, I hope everyone's now very thoroughly confused. But I just wanted to present some of the ideas and the classic understanding of besheret, which is you will meet this predestined person and it was already decided ages ago. Not true. Right? What is true is that if you have merit, you'll meet someone who is fantastic and ideal for you, and you have to work on that merit. But having said that, even if you have merit, you still need to do the pragmatic efforts as you do in other areas like earning a living, medical areas, and so on and so forth here too. And hopefully in the merit of learning Torah and the merit of going through this idea, that's in himself, right? I heard from my Rebbe, Rabbi Shapiro, that when you engage in the study of Torah of a particular, when you need something in a particular area, engage in the Torah study in that area. So here we are engaging in the Torah study of this area of the soulmate. And so in the merit of this, God willing, you should all find your match, your soulmate, whether predestined or not predestined, whether you go like the Rambam or the Zohar, but to find that match, to make the right decisions, to have the merit, and hopefully that GamZuli will be a meritorious vehicle for doing that. At least I know two of the people involved, the LeVees, and I'm sure the others are of equal. And so when you do, right? So, you know, the Gemara says, Loi milakol adam zoichelis rapos, right? You have a physician, there's a certain merit, right? If the person says, I want that physician, not this one, even if one is available without being Mechalel Shabbos, transgressing Shabbos, the other one is only available, we always go with the patient's choice because you don't get that merit through everyone. There's a certain merit of being a shliach, an agent for good things. And I believe that Matt has that merit. And I believe that through the study of Torah, which he's encouraging here, which we're doing together, will be a merit for everyone, God willing, to find your soulmate.